The silence in my cabin had a weight to it, a physical presence that settled over the timbers and seeped into the grain of the floorboards. For years it had been my only true companion, a vast and unchanging thing shaped by the rise and fall of the mountains outside. Snow fell in a slow, hypnotic curtain, muffling the world until the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low growl of my own breathing. I was a large man, built of the same rock and timber as my home, with hair and beard grown long and tangled like the forest undergrowth. Solitude was not a punishment. It was a fortress I had built for myself, stone by quiet stone, day by quiet day. I had learned the language of the wind in the pines, the creak of snow-laden branches, the skittering of unseen creatures in the eaves. These were my conversations, my connections to a world that had long ago proven it had little use for a man like me. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel both larger and more lonely. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn table I'd made, the surface worn smooth by my own hands, my own meals, my own endless solitude. There was a rhythm to my life here, predictable and safe. Chop wood, check snares, mend what was broken, and wait for the sun to dip below the jagged peaks. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: warmth, food, shelter, and silence. The profound, unending silence that I had mistaken for peace. It was a lie, I suppose, but one I had told myself for so long it had begun to feel like the truth. The world outside this cabin, the world of men and their laws and their cruelties, was a distant memory, a bad dream from which I had gratefully awoken. Here I was simply a part of the mountain, as constant and as quiet as the stone. But the snow kept falling, and in its relentless descent it seemed to be erasing everything, leaving only the white, empty canvas of the present. And in that emptiness, a feeling I refused to name began to stir, a cold spot deep in my chest that even the roaring fire could not touch. It was a sound so alien to my world that at first I thought I had imagined it. A soft, hesitant tapping against the heavy oak of my door. Not the scratching of a branch or the thud of falling snow, but a deliberate, human sound. I froze, my hand hovering over the tin cup on the table. No one came this high into the mountains, especially not in the heart of winter. Traders kept to the valleys, and hunters knew better than to trespass on this territory. I rose from my stool, my sheer size making the floorboards groan in protest. Each step toward the door was heavy with suspicion. My body tensed for a threat I could not yet see. I slid the heavy iron bolt, the screech of metal on metal a complaint against the intrusion. When I pulled the door open, the cold air rushed in, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes and a sight so unexpected it stole the breath from my lungs. A woman, small and delicate as a bird, stood on my threshold. She was swallowed by the vast white wilderness behind her, a fragile figure wrapped in a thin, worn prairie dress that was once white, but now looked gray against the brilliant snow. She was Chinese, her features fine and pale, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperation. She shivered violently, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. I stared down at her, a giant of a man looking at a porcelain doll left out in a blizzard. My mind struggled to make sense of her presence, of the impossible fact of her standing here, alone, in the teeth of a storm. Her lips, blue with cold, parted, and a small puff of white vapor escaped. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, almost lost to the sighing of the wind. "Can you act as my husband for 1 week?" The words hung in the frozen air between us, so absurd, so utterly insane, that for a long moment I could only stare, certain the mountain's profound solitude had finally fractured my mind. She looked up at me, her gaze pleading, and in her eyes I saw a fear so deep it was an abyss, a fear that had driven her through a blizzard to the door of a stranger like me. I should have said no. I should have closed the door and slid the bolt home, leaving her to the snow and whatever fate had chased her up my mountain. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. My life was built on avoiding the complications of others, on severing ties to a world that only brought pain. But I did not close the door. I looked at her, at the way the snow gathered on her dark hair, at the tremor in her small frame, and I saw not a complication, but a fledgling sparrow fallen from its nest into a drift of snow. I grunted, a sound that was neither yes nor no, and stepped back, a silent invitation into the warmth of the cabin. She hesitated for only a second before scurrying inside, bringing the chill of the outside world with her. She stood dripping on the floorboards just inside the door, her arms wrapped around herself, looking impossibly small in the large, sparse room dominated by my presence. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing the exhaustion etched into her young features. She could not have been more than 19. Why? The word was a rusty growl from my throat, unused to forming questions. She flinched at the sound of my voice, but did not look away. "There is a man," she began, her voice still quiet but steadier in the warmth of the cabin. "Mr. Finch, from the settlement. My husband, he passed 2 months ago. The sickness." She paused, swallowing hard. "Mr. Finch believes the land my husband claimed is now his for the taking. He believes I am alone. He comes to my cabin. He says things. He believes a woman, especially one like me, cannot hold a claim without a man." I understood. I had seen men like Finch in the valleys, vultures who circled the weak and the unfortunate. He would not stop at the land. "He is coming back in a few days to make his final offer. If he sees you, if he believes I have remarried, he will leave me be." It was a desperate, flimsy plan, a shield made of lies. But looking at her, I saw it was the only shield she had. "1 week," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "That is all I ask." The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss and pop of the logs in the hearth. I was turning the request over in my mind, weighing the disruption against the raw plea in her eyes. I was a man who lived by a simple code, and that code did not involve turning away someone so clearly at the mercy of wolves. "There's a cot by the fire," I said, my voice rough. "You can sleep there." It wasn't a yes, not directly, but she understood. A wave of relief so profound washed over her face that she seemed to sway on her feet. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "My name is Leanne." I simply nodded, not offering my own. My name was a thing I had not shared in a very long time. The first day of our arrangement was a study in silence, but it was a new kind of silence, taut and fragile, filled with the presence of another human being. She had slept on the cot, curled beneath a thick bear pelt I had left for her without a word. I had risen before dawn, as was my habit, moving with a practiced quietness so as not to wake her. But when I turned from stoking the fire, I found her awake, her dark eyes watching me from the shadows. There was a wariness in her gaze, the look of a creature accustomed to predators. We did not speak. I went about my morning chores, pulling on my heavy coat and boots to go outside and chop wood. The air was sharp and clean, the world buried under a fresh blanket of snow. The rhythmic thud of my axe against the wood was a familiar comfort, a language I understood. Each swing was a thought, each split log a punctuation mark. I was thinking of the woman in my cabin, of the lie we had agreed to. It felt foolish, a child's game against a dangerous man. Yet the image of her standing in the snow, so utterly defenseless, had imprinted itself on my mind. When I returned, stamping the snow from my boots, The air inside was different. It smelled faintly of tea. She had found my small stash of dried herbs and had brewed a pot over the fire. She held a steaming cup out to me, her movements hesitant. I took it, my large calloused fingers brushing against hers. The touch was fleeting, electric. Her skin was soft. It was a jarring sensation, a reminder of a world of gentleness I had long since forgotten. "I used the last of the herbs," she said, her voice soft, apologetic. "I am sorry." I shook my head. "It's fine." The words felt clumsy in my mouth. We ate a breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits, the silence broken only by the sound of our chewing and the crackle of the flames. I watched her from under my thick brows. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite. She was like a ghost at my table, a whisper of a person who had drifted into my fortress of solitude. Later she found a broom and began to sweep the floor, her movements graceful and efficient. It was a strange thing to witness, this small act of domesticity in my rugged, masculine space. My cabin had never been swept with such care. It was as if she were trying to pay for her safety with small labors, to make herself useful, to earn her place by the fire. I said nothing, merely watched, feeling like an intruder in my own home. The knock came 2 days later, harder and more arrogant than Leanne's had been. It was the middle of the afternoon, the sun a pale, distant disk in the winter sky. Leanne, who had been mending a tear in her white dress by the fire, froze, her needle poised in mid-air. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as the snow outside. Her eyes darted to mine, wide with panic. I gave a slow, deliberate nod and rose to my full height, my shadow engulfing her small form. I moved to the door, my heart a steady, heavy drum in my chest. This was the moment the lie would be tested. I opened the door to a man whose face was a map of petty cruelties. He was of average height, but carried himself with an unearned swagger, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. His eyes were small and greedy, and they flickered past me, trying to peer into the cabin's interior. "I'm looking for the Chinaman's widow," he said, his voice slick with contempt. "Heard she might have run up this way. You seen her?" I didn't move from the doorway, blocking his view. My size was an advantage, a wall of muscle and beard that men like him understood better than words. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting him take in the full measure of me. "There's no widow here," I said, my voice a low rumble. His eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Funny, her cabin's empty, and tracks lead this way." He tried to crane his neck to see around me again. It was then that Leanne moved. She stood up and came to stand just behind my shoulder, her small hand resting tentatively on my arm. It was a gesture of possession, an anchor in the storm of our deception. Finch's eyes locked on her, and a triumphant, ugly smirk spread across his face. "Well, look at that. Hiding behind a big fella, are you?" He looked back at me, his eyes filled with derision. "Found yourself a new protector, have you?" I felt Leanne's fingers tighten on my arm. I looked down at her, then back at the man. The lie came easily, tasting like iron and ash on my tongue. "She's my wife." The words were simple, spoken with a flat finality that left no room for argument. Finch's smirk faltered. He studied me again, his gaze lingering on my formidable frame and the hard set of my jaw. He was a bully, and bullies are cowards at heart. They prey on the weak, not those who can break them in two. He clearly weighed his options and found them wanting. "Is that a fact?" he sneered, though the bravado was gone from his voice. I just stared at him, my silence a more potent threat than any words. After a tense moment, he spat on the snow. "Well, ain't that cozy?" He backed away from the door, his eyes still darting between me and Leanne. You just remember, that claim's on my list." He turned and stomped back to his horse, leaving us in a sudden, ringing silence. I closed the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing the slamming of a door in my heart. Leanne's hand was still on my arm. When I looked down, her face was turned up to mine, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a fragile, burgeoning trust. "Thank you, Abram," she whispered, saying my name for the first time. She had heard me use it once when talking to myself, and had remembered. Hearing it from her lips felt strangely intimate, as if she had laid claim to a part of me. The departure of Finch changed the air between us. The lie we had told was no longer just a plan. It was a thing we had built together, a shared secret that now bound us. The cabin, which had felt like my solitary fortress, now felt like our shared refuge. The tension of two strangers navigating an awkward arrangement began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, comfortable rhythm. We started to talk, not in long conversations, but in small exchanges that slowly filled in the empty spaces of our knowledge of each other. She told me about her husband, Gian. He had been a scholar in their homeland, a gentle man with ink-stained fingers who dreamed of a life where his wife would never want for anything. They had come across the ocean with hearts full of hope, only to find a land that was harder and colder than they had ever imagined. "He was not built for this place," she said one evening, her eyes fixed on the fire. "His hands were made for brushes and paper, not an axe." There was a profound sadness in her voice, but no bitterness. She had loved him, and his memory was a gentle thing she carried with her. In return, I found myself speaking of things I had not given voice to in years. I told her my name was Abram. I told her I had come to the mountains after a life in the East, a life that had ended in loss. I didn't give her details, just the shape of the grief. A wife, a fever, a world that suddenly felt hollow and loud. "The silence up here," I explained, gesturing to the dark windows. It was the only thing that didn't hurt to listen to. She listened without judgment, her quiet presence an invitation to unpack the heavy stones I had carried for so long. She learned my habits, the way I liked my coffee black, the specific log I always saved to bank the fire for the night. I learned hers, the soft, humming tune she favored when she was mending, the way she would pause by the window to watch the jays squabbling in the pines. One afternoon she found a small, smooth stone near the hearth and began to clean it meticulously. For the rest of the day she held it, warming it in her hands, its presence seeming to offer some small comfort. These small discoveries were like mapping a new country, each one revealing a hidden stream or a quiet valley. The lie had forced us together, but it was the truth, shared in the fire-lit intimacy of the cabin, that was truly beginning to bind us. The space between us, once a chasm of silence and suspicion, was shrinking with every shared glance, every soft-spoken word, every quiet moment of mutual understanding. The end of the week approached like a distant storm cloud, a shadow on the horizon of our strange, temporary peace. The pretense would soon be over. Leanne would be safe, Finch would be gone, and she would return to her cabin. I would be left here, in my fortress of solitude, but the silence I had once craved now seemed like it would be a crushing, unbearable thing. The thought of this cabin without her quiet presence, without the scent of her herbal tea, without the soft sound of her breathing in the night, left a hollow ache in my chest. I had grown accustomed to her being there, a small, warm light in the vast wilderness of my life. The lie had been a bridge, and I found myself terrified of it being washed away, leaving us on opposite shores once more. One evening, the last of our agreed-upon week, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. The fire crackled and spat, the only sound in the room. Leanne sat on the hearth, mending her dress again, the same white dress she had arrived in. Her needle moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, a small domestic act that seemed both incredibly beautiful and heartbreakingly fragile. I watched her hands, the way her delicate fingers guided the thread, and I was struck by a fierce protective urge. I could not send her back to a world that would treat her so cruelly, a world that would see her as nothing more than an obstacle or an opportunity. I could not return to my own empty existence. The words rose from a place deep inside me, a place I thought had long since turned to stone. I don't want this to be an act. My voice was rough, heavy with emotion. She stopped her mending, her hands going still in her lap. She slowly lifted her head, her dark eyes, luminous in the firelight, meeting mine. There was surprise in them, and something else, a cautious, fragile hope. I moved from my chair, kneeling on the floorboards in front of her. The motion felt both foreign and completely natural. I was a mountain of a man, humbling myself before this small, resilient woman. "Leanne," I said, her name a prayer on my lips. "Stay. Stay here with me." I reached out, my calloused, work-worn hand trembling slightly, and gently cupped her cheek. The contrast was everything. My rough, scarred skin against her smooth, warm flesh. Her skin was like silk. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thing I had ever done. She did not pull away from my touch. For a long, breathless moment, she simply looked at me, her eyes searching my face, reading the truth of my words and the lines etched there by loneliness and time. Then a small, shuddering breath escaped her lips, and she leaned into my hand, a silent surrender that made my heart ache with a feeling that was equal parts triumph and terror. Her eyes fluttered closed, and I felt the dampness of a single tear against my thumb. She had been so strong, so resilient, but in this moment she allowed her vulnerability to show, and it was the most profound gift she could have given me. "Here," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "With you, I have not felt afraid." It was her own confession, a simple and powerful truth that mirrored my own. In her presence, the crushing weight of my solitude had lifted. We had, in our own quiet ways, been a balm for each other's wounds. The space between us was no longer measured in feet and inches, but in the beat of our own hearts, which seemed to have found the same rhythm. The fire cast a warm, golden glow over the scene, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent witnesses. I moved my other hand to her other cheek, holding her face gently between my large palms. She was so delicate, so precious. I leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, to stop me. But she didn't. She tilted her head up, her lips parting slightly in anticipation. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, a tentative question. It was hesitant, gentle, a kiss that spoke of shared grief and the fear of being hurt again. But then something shifted. The caution gave way to a deeper, more urgent need. The kiss deepened, becoming a repository for all the unspoken loneliness, all the fear of the last week, and all the burgeoning hope for a future I hadn't dared to imagine. It was a promise made in the silent, fire-lit cabin, a seal on the truth that had grown from a desperate lie. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. I rested my forehead against hers, the world shrinking to this single, perfect point of contact. The pretense was over. The act was finished. And in its place, something real and incredibly beautiful had begun to grow. The next morning, the world was reborn. A heavy snowfall during the night had blanketed everything in a thick, pristine layer of white. The light that filtered through the single window was soft and diffused, filling the cabin with a peaceful, ethereal glow. The week was over. By the terms of our agreement, Leanne should have been preparing to leave. But as I watched her sleeping on the cot, her face relaxed and peaceful in the morning light, I knew she was not going anywhere. She was home. I built up the fire and put a pot of coffee on to brew, the familiar actions feeling new and significant. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, she looked at me, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. "Good morning, husband," she said softly, the word no longer a lie, but a gentle, teasing promise. I felt a grin split my own bearded face, a rare occurrence. "Good morning, wife," I replied, my voice filled with a warmth I hadn't known it could possess. The day was spent not in the tense silence of strangers, but in the comfortable quiet of partners. We spoke of the future, not in grand, sweeping plans, but in the small, practical details of a life to be built together. We would need to fetch her belongings from her old cabin before the snows became too deep. We would need to plant a garden come spring. We would face whatever came next, including the lingering threat of Finch, as a unit. The lie had become our truth, a foundation forged in desperation, but now solidified by genuine affection and a shared desire for a life free from fear and loneliness. We ate our lunch sitting at the rough-hewn table, our shoulders occasionally brushing, each touch a small reassurance. I found myself watching her, memorizing the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the thoughtful expression on her face as she looked out at the snow-covered landscape. This small cabin, once a symbol of my isolation, had transformed. With her in it, it was no longer just a shelter from the storms outside. It had become a home, a sanctuary filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now, not empty, but full. It was the peaceful silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words, a quiet space where love could quietly, gently, take root and grow. A few days later, we stood on the small porch I had built, watching as the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of orange, pink, and deep purple, the colors reflecting off the endless expanse of snow, making the world look like it was made of jewels. A cold, clean wind whispered through the pines, but I barely felt it. Leanne stood beside me, tucked under my arm, her head resting against my chest. I had wrapped one of my thick wool blankets around her shoulders, and its warmth mingled with her own. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the day end and the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. I looked down at the top of her head, at the dark, shining hair, and a feeling of profound contentment settled over me. For years I had believed that my life was meant to be a solitary one, that the hole in my heart left by past grief was a permanent fixture. I had cultivated my loneliness like a crop, tending to it until it was all I knew. I had mistaken the absence of pain for the presence of peace. Leanne's arrival had shattered that illusion. She had walked out of a blizzard and into the very center of my world, and in doing so had shown me what I had truly been missing. It wasn't conversation or company in the traditional sense. It was this shared silence, this effortless closeness, this quiet understanding that we were no longer two separate, broken people, but two halves of a new whole. The fortress I had built to keep the world out had become a home to welcome her in. The silence I had used as a shield had become a language between us, a space filled not with emptiness, but with unspoken love and a deep, abiding peace. The mountain was still my home, but I was no longer just a part of its stone and silence. I was a husband. I was loved. And as the first star of evening burned brightly in the cold, clear sky, I knew, with a certainty that reached into the very marrow of my bones, that I would never be truly alone again.